Good morning. Welcome to our webinar session on qualitative data today. Really glad to have you with us. We are going to get started here and expect to use most of our time until noon today. We'll have some different activities that you can be doing, as well as some breaks during the morning, and are just so pleased to have you here with us. My name is Becky Stewart. I work at the Improve Group, and we'll be joined in this webinar facilitation by Ari, who will also say a few words. We are both working for the Improve Group, which is a worker-owned evaluation consulting cooperative. We provide evaluation, planning, facilitation, and community engagement support for different mission-driven organizations, from nonprofits to foundations to government at all levels. So we are excited to kind of share some reflections today about qualitative data. I know Ari will say a few words about her uh, what she loves about qualitative data, but I'll also just say over the 20 years that I've been at the Improve Group, we've just seen a lot of times how powerful qualitative data can be, whether it's complementing some quantitative data or surveys that you're doing or records that you might have, or just on its own has a real power in helping you understand things deeply, be able to really tell a rich story about what's happening and what kind of change is going on. So it can be a really powerful way of learning and understanding more about your work, and we're excited to talk to you about that today. Ari, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, you covered a lot of what I was thinking. So I'll do just a quick intro. Hi, everybody. My name is Ari Kapuczynski. I am an associate consultant at the Improve Group. And I love qualitative work, data collection and analysis. It's so powerful and important to me to be able to hear directly from community members who are directly impacted by issues that we're trying to learn about, and hearing directly from them and their lived experience is what is so important and powerful to me, as well as everything that Becky said in addition. So I'm excited to share a little bit more about qualitative methods with you all.
Great. And I think I'll just add, I know from our work with the Minnesota Department of Health to get set up on this webinar and your registration notes that a lot of you have experience with qualitative data collection and qualitative data in one way or another. Um, and so hopefully there's some new nuggets in here or things to clarify your work uh, more and help you kind of even take it to a new level. So we're looking forward to getting through all that today. And I think one other thing that I might just add is that the again this is the Minnesota Department of Health, their sexual violence prevention group, also added not only are folks using it, but just finding a lot of value in terms of ways to engage, ways to interact, as well as ways to learn. So that's um, that's what we're looking forward to deepening today. All right, so just a few as here we are in our um, Zoom webinar. We've got a few tools that might look a little different from when you're in a Zoom meeting, so we just wanted to make sure that's clear for folks. So obviously on this, we've got a picture of your Zoom webinar tools here. Starting on the left-hand side, you'll see just the audio microphone button where you can make adjustments to your own settings if you want. Then moving to the right on your toolbar, the chat button, which actually is disabled since this is a webinar. And then the Q&A. That's the button that you would use to obviously submit questions and see and hear, and we'll probably be talking about answers, but we might answer a few by typing as well. And then the Q&A button you could also use for technical difficulties. So if you're having any technical difficulties, if you want to send us a note there, we'll try to help you out. And then there's a transcript. You will be seeing a transcript. A transcript will be shared with everyone who registered, so that's coming your way soon. Um, Captioning is is available today. We're getting a cart captioner joining us shortly here, so that support will be available. And then we're also recording this webinar, and as well as that transcript, there will be the slides from this webinar as well as a recording that will be available to you. All right, so let's talk about what we're going to do today. We're going to start with on our agenda why and how to use qualitative methods. Then we're going to move into kind of how you think about sampling and recruitment. Then we're going to move into some advice and tips on how to write effective questions. And then we will do a little practicing with some of those skills before we take a break. Then after that, we're going to get into effective interviewing skills, and then facilitation tips for focus groups. Do a little practicing and take a break. And then after that, get into note taking and setting up for analysis, and another opportunity to practice a couple of those skills before we take another break. And then finally wrapping up with some tips for sharing and reporting. Well, you can ask questions anytime in the Q&A, and what we're planning to do is just address those after each of the breaks. All right, so first we have our highly rigorous uh, cat poll here, where we have some cats to express your feelings about qualitative work. So you can we've popped up a poll here about oh, sorry, back to our cat poll here about whether you feel number one, our black cat, a picture of a black cat on the left looking so frustrated. And then we've got number two, our marmalade cat, looking a little dissatisfied about qualitative work. And then we've got a nice little tiger cat next who's looking satisfied. And then a highly delighted number four, jumping over the moon, orange tabby on the right here. So you can choose what you think describes how you feel about qualitative work, or if you don't have any experience, you can note that too.
I'm waiting 10 more seconds, so the poll will be open for 1 whole minute, and then I'll close it real quick. Oh, we got some last minute people.
Yay.
Okay, great. All right, gonna end the poll now and share out our results.
All right.
Can you see the results, Becky?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So we have yeah, and our long-awaited cat poll results. We have no one who's feeling frustrated about qualitative work. We have a few people who are feeling a little dissatisfied, so hopefully there's some things today that'll help you feel more satisfied about that. The most of the Not most, but of the largest category of people we have are those who are feeling fairly satisfied with their qualitative work. There are some good boosters here. About a quarter of us are feeling delighted with qualitative work. And then there's some folks who don't have um, experience with qualitative work. So that's a good mix, I think. And hopefully there'll be something for everyone today. Great. Well, I'm just going to move then ahead into when to use um, qualitative methods. And well, first let's talk about what are some examples of qualitative methods. People might have different thoughts about or different impressions about what it is. And so we have some ones that you might be more familiar, like interviews, or focus groups. And sometimes folks might be calling those listening sessions where you've got a group gathered and are kind of doing some listening together. And then we also might also consider observations as qualitative methods where you're observing some activity. Maybe you're watching how someone's doing a role play after a training and making some notes about that. Um, and then another thing that you might also want to remember is that arts-based methods can be qualitative as well. So there's opportunities for being creative here. In fact, there's a lot of different things that we could consider qualitative methods, and just really the main thing is that they are not numbers. So let's talk about when to use qualitative methods. Some these are signals to you that the qualitative methods would be a good choice for you. So one is answering how or why questions, or really any questions. Um, where you are want to get to more descriptive answers rather than something that's quantified. So if you want to know, how many or how often or which ones to prioritize, things like that, those are better for quantitative methods versus understanding, getting more about why is this important or how did this matter. And then another sign could be if you are wanting to answer exploratory questions or learning about the environment or context. So if you feel like you've got a lot of questions and you don't are not understanding fully what's going on and you really want to understand more, get a better picture, then that would be a good time to use some qualitative methods. Um, they're also good to look at in-depth responses. So if you're not going to be satisfied with the percent to agree with something, but you really want to know what is most important or why do they agree, then that would be good to use a qualitative method for. Providing stories and examples of experiences. So you might be thinking about how you want to use your what you learned from your evaluation and thinking that some stories will be really powerful, or maybe some examples of experiences could help others see how this program is going to help them or help you boost support for your work. Or really complement maybe some statistics that you have, providing a good story along with those would be a good complement. So if you're looking for that kind of data, definitely use some qualitative methods. And then also, qualitative methods are great for providing opportunities to ask unscripted follow-up questions based on what you're learning. So kind of going hand in hand with the circumstances where you really feel like you probably don't know everything that you need to know to even ask your questions. So you might need to, based on what someone is telling you, want the opportunities to ask them more prompts. Tell me more about this, or examples, and in what scenarios does that happen? And so qualitative methods are great for allowing you to be able to do that follow-up based on what you're hearing in the moment. So again, they're not good for understanding how much of something is happening across a large group or population. You're going to want to use more like a quantitative method if you're trying to understand sort of the prevalence of something across a large group, or if you're kind of doing regular monitoring. We've got these measures that we're paying attention to over time. Those would be better, but set for quantitative methods. And lastly, just as you're considering when to use these methods, another thing is don't be careful not to think of them as quick and easy. Oh, it's just an hour for a focus group and we're done. That there's a lot of work that goes into planning these things for them to go well. And we'll talk about that today. And then you are also, when you're done, left with qualitative data, which is rich and beautiful and also not really quick always to interpret. So we want to just remember that that is don't be kind of jump to the conclusion that it's going to be the quickest way to go. All right, so which method should you use? So we're not going to get into kind of deep developing your evaluation questions or learning questions in this training, since that's not specific to qualitative work, but maybe just a few things here that we wanted to share about how you choose what method of qualitative what qualitative method you're going to use. So one of the considerations that you'll want to think about is just starting out of the gates with what you're hoping to learn, and that's kind of your evaluation questions or the questions that you have in your mind that you're hoping to answer. And you really need to be ground your work in that so that you're not kind of so you make sure that those are answered through the work that you're doing, and you're not at your qualitative method that you're using, and that you're not kind of asking a lot of additional questions that'll only add to the volume of data that you have and the time that you're asking of others. So you want to be carefully think about, what am I really trying to learn here? And then you want to consider what will work best for who you want to engage. So maybe some people feel most comfortable verbally describing an experience, or as we talked about earlier, perhaps it's going to be through art or maybe a role play or something like that. Um, or are there specific ways that people prefer to share knowledge, perhaps telling stories? So maybe a storytelling circle, or even creating a play based on their experience. So trying to think about what, given who you're trying to engage, what will work best for them in terms of sharing their knowledge. Then you also want to consider whether it will be helpful or harmful to be in a group. So sometimes groups can be really helpful for prompting one another to think about things. Maybe you're recalling exactly what happened or a topic. We can help one another think more deeply about a topic. But it can also be, groups can be like not a great fit and even harmful if you've got very sensitive topics where a one-on-one situation, like an interview, might be more supportive for somebody who's sharing more sensitive information rather than asking them to share that in front of a group of others they don't know well. And then, as you're considering your resources and opportunities, some things to think about there. First are your own skill sets. So, are one-on-one interviews easier than group facilitation? But I know a lot of folks here might do group facilitation a lot, and those skills would be right there for you to use. So, just thinking about what skills you have. Another thing is what opportunities you have. So perhaps you can embed an observation into an activity that you're already doing, or folks are gathered for an event and you can ask them to come during lunch and do a listening session or a focus group with you during lunch rather than eating somewhere else. So just kind of thinking about what opportunities you have and what's convenient for the people you want to engage. We have as an example, we have a client that does a lot of violence prevention work, and they've got a big kind of teen gathering summit conference event that they are doing, and they do a kind of a version of a graffiti wall during the event. Where the participants can add their reactions and also see the reactions and be inspired by the reactions that other people are having. So it gives them some insights on that, as well as they have some peers going around doing peer interviews during the event. And again, just kind of deepening their understanding about what's happening and people's experience of the event beyond just the survey as well. We won't get as much into creative methods today, but I really encourage you to check out some, there's different examples online. And we have used arts-based methods in some situations with sensitive topics, and they've worked out really well with folks. So I encourage you to consider that as well. All right, so sampling and recruitment. When we think about qualitative methods and the how or why questions that you are wanting to answer, you also want to think about who to engage in answering those questions. Um, and so some common sampling methods that we might use in this kind of work are purposive. I never know how to say that correctly, and I say it differently every time. um, sampling. And that is you're being purposeful about your sampling and you're recruiting people who will likely be able to answer your evaluation questions. So perhaps you're going to make a list of clients or program participants who've had experience with the program that you're evaluating. That's who you want to talk to. And so that's you're purposefully thinking about who has the experience that we want to talk to and how you can get in front of them with an invitation to participate. Another kind of sampling method is called snowball sampling, not just used here in Minnesota where it's cold, but even warm climates use sampling. And in snowball sampling, you're going to be asking each interviewee or a person who's participating to refer you to somebody else they know who may be interested in participating, and then inviting them to come. So this is a great opportunity for you to gain kind of introductions using the natural kind of networks and communities and where you wouldn't necessarily have had a list of everyone in the community who might have a shared characteristic, but because you're relying on community networks, that can be a really effective way to get into those seams of people you're trying to reach. Then next we've got convenience sampling, and that's kind of recruiting people who are easy to contact and invite. And so an example of this, you might want to think about maybe you're tabling in a community event and you ask people who approach your table to answer a feedback question. Um, or I mentioned another example could be those peer interviews that are going on at that teen summit event where folks are just trying to recruit people to do a short interview while they're in the hallways at this conference. I'll just note here for a convenience sample, even though you're working at your convenience, it's still important to try to be somewhat systematic. So, for instance, if you're at this event doing some tabling, you might want to think to yourself, okay, I'm going to ask every third person who comes up if they'll do this, or some other rule like that to keep yourself at least a little bit systematic about this. One thing is that we all naturally, as humans, may do is have a sort of an unconscious preference to ask people maybe who seem friendly to us or seem familiar to us or feel like us, and that can lead to some more bias than you would like in who you talk to and what you hear back. So. That's one, try to be, even if you're working at your convenience, try to be a little bit systematic in some way about how you do that. So these different kinds of sampling methods do enable you to find people who hold the specific types of knowledge that you want, and so that you can learn from them. And but just to remember, and again with qualitative work, this does not enable you to generalize findings to a larger population. So you won't be able to say from those peer interviews at the Teen Summit, we talked to these 10 youth during the summit, and therefore everyone at the summit thinks that this is a great event. That you can say that the interviewees that we talked to expressed this is one of the more powerful experiences that they had during the summit. So it's useful for just describing that again, that experience deeply, but just being careful not to generalize to a larger population. That's not the purpose of your qualitative work. Okay, so if you have some lists to help you recruit, that you're sort of going to be sampling from a list. So maybe that's you've got some training participants, or maybe you've got a list of students on a campus. You want to have some criteria that you can kind of check your invitation list against, and then or to narrow down your invitation list even from a broader list, and then use that criteria to adjust your list down to a smaller size, and then send invitations to those folks to participate. And in terms of the criteria that you'll want to have in mind, we'll encourage you to think of it in two ways. One would be some recruitment criteria, where you want people to have a common criteria. You want everyone to have certain characteristics. So perhaps that they have accessed services in this program in the last 12 months, or that they are at least 18 years old, So you want everyone who's going to participate have some kind of criteria. That's your recruitment criteria. Then you also want to think about some diversity criteria. You want to have common criteria, but you also want to hear diversity of opinion. So you want to think about what are the different kinds of perspectives and experiences that you are hoping for folks to have. And then you can be thinking about how might you do some outreach and encourage participation in order to get that diversity of perspectives and experiences engaged in your qualitative method. All right, so then if you're sampling from the general public and you don't have an existing list, you can use your recruitment criteria in outreach language. So again, to say we're looking for people who've participated in this program in the last 18 months or who are at least 18 years old. So you can include that in your outreach language. And you can also add like a little bit of a screener survey. We find that really helpful too for people to click on a link and then they answer a few questions about themselves, just so you can make sure that they fit that recruitment criteria that you're looking for. And you can also collect information about people as they respond. So again, in that screener survey, if they give you a little bit of information about themselves, then you can also understand how well you're doing in terms of your kind of diversity of perspectives and experience criteria that you have in mind. And then you can do sort of targeted outreach to try to fill in gaps in that criteria. So even going up to some of the sampling methods we talked about before, you're trying to encourage people with certain kinds of experiences or backgrounds or perspectives to be involved. And so you might do some targeted outreach to bump up their participation and get them signed up to be involved. All right, so then we wanted to talk about how to appropriately kind of connect with and compensate people for your qualitative method. So we're going to start with compensation. And there's a couple ways to think about this. So one is thinking about it as providing an incentive or kind of a symbolic gesture. And this draws on a theory of kind of social reciprocity, where people feel like you've given them something and they want to give you something back. And these are largely, therefore, symbolic kind of thank you gifts, and they tend to be sort of lower amounts. Another way to think about compensation is that people are participating and providing you with expertise. And so we want to compensate that expertise. A lot of times, one of the things that we pay attention to and are concerned about sometimes is if people are participating in something as part of their jobs, then they are getting compensated for that time. So, as a staff person, I'm asked to come give my feedback during my workday. I'm being compensated for that time. Whereas in other circumstances, people are not being asked to do it as part of their job. And so therefore, there's some disparity there where there's people who are and maybe in the same group or getting asked to do the same thing, and some are getting compensated and others are not. So that's one way to think about it, as well as, again, considering that people are providing you with expertise. And if you called up a consultant with a capital C and ask them to talk to you on the phone and give you advice about what's important to pay attention to and why, they would expect to be paid. And so, yeah, so then you're thinking about how to provide compensation for that hour of, or whatever it is, of advice and consultation, providing you with their expertise that maybe from their lived experience rather than from a job or educational credentials or something, formal educational credentials. And then the other thing to consider in terms of compensation is that people are incurring costs, direct costs, such as childcare or transportation. And so the more that you can help to cover those costs, that will reduce barriers to participation. Okay, so then for outreach, if we think about some different approaches to outreach, some helpful questions for general public recruiting could be where might we find people with the characteristics in our sample? So again, thinking about your recruitment criteria and your diversity criteria, both of them, where might we find folks with those kinds of experiences and qualities? Um, And then you might be thinking within those places where might it be helpful to place some kinds of advertisements or whether that's physical flyers or virtual invitations or notices. And then another really valuable thing to do is think about partnerships. So, what kinds of partnerships might we form with trusted people who are well placed with these communities or groups to get the word out? And so, some things we might think about sometimes are partnering with faith leaders or community centers or businesses who have a lot of employees who might fit the bill. Um, or maybe service providers who might provide services to folks who have the kind of qualities that you're looking for, and they're willing to post a QR code with your notice of your event and your link to your screener survey. And just again, to keep those partnerships, nurture those partnerships, you want to kind of involve partners throughout, help them understand why it's important for people to participate in this, what they might even learn, what you can share back with them so they can learn as well from your results, and kind of build up some anticipation for that learning and what we'll know after folks have participated. So just kind of helping to nurture that partnership and their engagement and helping you with recruitment. And then finally, just as you're doing just general public recruiting, some caution with public invites like flyers or social media that's just posted broadly, that you'll probably get, especially if you're providing incentives, a lot of kind of spamming or people who are just trying to quick get the incentive. Remember that screener survey is really helpful in terms of if you're really clear that you're looking for certain kinds of characteristics and asking questions where people have to provide some detail about those characteristics. That will help people realize that you are looking for specific kinds of people. They're going to need to participate in order to get paid, and that you'll be able to tell if they really have had or get some more insight about whether they really had the kinds of experiences that you're looking for from those screener survey questions. Um, so if you are then thinking about what kinds of questions to use for recruiting from a client or participant list, so you already have a list, you're not now just working with the general public, you could think about who is a trusted person for these participants to hear from. So um, that can be really helpful and powerful if this is like someone who's been a mentor to people or has been around a lot and they know them well and they trust them to be a good source of someone who's saying, no, this is really important to be part of, or this is a great event, or you can trust these people to who are doing these groups or these interviews. So identifying those folks. At the same time, you kind of want to balance that with considering issues of power or potential perceptions of coercion. So, that's it's one thing for people to kind of publicize an event, but you for sure don't want them to feel like, a potential participant to think like, oh, I better sign up for this, or this teacher isn't going to give me a good grade, or this next time I come in, this caseworker might not, might be a little harder on me if I don't participate. So, just trying to think about those issues of power and coercion, how you can best address those. Um, and it's for sure keeping kind of separate whether or not people participate should be more confidential and just between you and them. And also thinking about the language that people are using to invite folks and making sure it's really clear that it's optional and there's no repercussions if they don't participate. We had a question in the registration about teens, and we're trying to reach teens and work with teens and qualitative data. So we thought we'd add just a little bit here. Um, it is with teens, some of the things that we've noticed in our work is that it's really helpful to sort of meet them where they're at. So, for instance, we had a group of teens that was doing a virtual hangout every Thursday, and we asked if it was possible for us, if they would allow us to come and use one of their virtual hangouts to have a group conversation. So, it's their space, a space that they were used to, and a space that they were comfortable with, and they allowed us to come join them. If they're already another thing to think about is kind of interest groups. So if they're already kind of an association, like a particular club or something like that, that where they're already gathered is with some common interest, that's a great recruiting place to start with. I I know this keenly as a parent that email, they'll never open it. So Facebook is getting old. So I'm trying to again think about where they're at online and what kind of social media, if you're trying to work that way and get in touch with them, will be helpful for or effective at getting through to them. That recommendation we had about trusted people inviting them, we found that to be really helpful in terms of getting their attention and making them understand that this is real and why it matters. And incentives, of course, we just mentioned that, and it does really matter. So that's some thoughts about kind of trying to get teens involved. Next, about outreach language. So when you're doing outreach language, we just wanted to include some reminders here about what you want to include so that people are fully informed and about what this event is and about how to think about it. So using plain language, you want to include what's the purpose of the evaluation, who is doing the evaluation, how will the results be used, how will results be shared with participants, and when. What should participants expect in terms of format or duration? What level of confidentiality or anonymity is being used? What benefits to them or risks might they face? Make sure, as I mentioned earlier, that they understand that participation is voluntary. You might be encouraging them to participate, but make sure they understand it's totally fine, their choice about whether they do it or not. And then also providing a contact person for questions. So those are just some of the things you should make sure to include in your outreach language. And then lastly, kind of remember accessibility as you're doing outreach and then obviously in data collection as well to plan for differing abilities. In your outreach materials, you want to make sure that they're accessible and using then remember to use different forms of outreach. There are different forms will work better and worse for different groups. And then also remember to ask in screeners or kind of in your setup communication what would improve participants' experience, such as ASL interpretation or other having a language interpreter or other things. So you want to, again, reduce barriers and encourage participation. So the more you can do these things, the more likely you're going to get the full range of different kinds of participants, and that will give you the best, kind of most valid data because you've been able to reduce barriers. So you're not kind of biasing who you're getting in by only having some people be able to kind of access and have the same kind of experience. So let's think as you're doing your outreach, what are the goals that you're going to have? What are you trying to go for with your outreach? In focus groups or listening sessions, you're going to think about maybe between 5 to 15 people per group. I'd say 15 is getting pretty big. It's going to be hard to have like a nice conversational feel at 15 people. You might get be a lot easier for some folks to just remain quiet all the time, or a little bit the dynamics might get a little bit harder to manage. And then if you're less than 5, it's getting kind of harder to understand if there's diversity of or prompt for diversity of opinions in the discussion. You want the group to have some shared characteristic or experiences. So that's that kind of recruitment criteria that you're trying to think of, um, while also welcoming some diversity of experiences. So that's the other criteria that we talked about earlier. As you're putting your groups together, consider power dynamics. So sometimes often we've separated maybe adults from youth. Different cultures might separate women from men. So just thinking about what are the power dynamics. Again, you want this to be the most comfortable, frank conversation and discussion. So it's to your benefit to think about what's real about those power dynamics and adjust your groups accordingly. You also want to have multiple groups. It's going to be harder for you to feel confident about what you can say if you've only had a single group. So if you can have at least a few groups, that gives you a little bit more of a sense of feel for what's out there in terms of differences of opinions. For interviews, you're looking for a diversity of perspectives. So you are trying to think about that as you're building out your list and seeing who you've got represented there. In terms of the total number, you're going to try to consider your resources for how many of these things you can do. And so obviously you can do interview upon interview upon interview and get to lots of them. It's really resources are probably going to provide a very real cap for you there. One thing that we sometimes think about is this notion of saturation. So sometimes you might be doing interviews, and after you've done 10 of them, you're starting to hear kind of the same theme across a lot of your interviews. And so then you might be starting to think, okay, I've interviewed people from a diversity of perspectives. I'm starting to really get a good sense of what some strong themes are that are coming through. And maybe I'm getting to some saturation point and I can slow down or stop my interviewing. So that might be something that you can monitor for. On consent, we wanted to provide some considerations for how to think about this in terms of qualitative work. So, with qualitative work especially, it's common for us to be asking or for people to be sharing and telling their stories. And that can bring up a lot of fears about confidentiality or how information will be used. And it's easy in these circumstances, as opposed to a survey, which can feel really anonymous, for people participating in qualitative data collection, that this might feel more personal to them. It might make them feel more vulnerable or nervous about participating. So you want to be really thoughtful about consent here. We also had a question in the registration about data sovereignty, and we wanted to touch on it here as one place in our webinar today. And just remembering that there's laws governing consent that are imposed by different kind of jurisdictions, and that Native nations are another jurisdiction, just like any political jurisdiction, just like any others, and would have their own laws and expectations about data ownership and what's okay to share, and how things should be collected and how consent should be managed. We need to make sure that we're being aware of that if we're trying to do our data collection with Native nations. Hopefully, that is for a good project that's starting off in collaboration, where the purpose of what you're doing and the importance of it is developed in collaboration with the nation. But just remembering that would be the jurisdiction that would be able to control and set the bounds of data protections and consent. So when to address consent. So it's really helpful in qualitative data collection to think about this at multiple times. So in outreach, we talked about making sure to fully inform people about the circumstances and their rights and the risks, et cetera, during outreach, and make sure that they understand that it's voluntary and that this is that you're inviting them to participate. That's important to do at the outreach stage. And then at the beginning of an interview or focus group discussion, whatever your qualitative method is, you want to take some time to make sure that people understand again that this is their choice, that they fully understand how the circumstances in which they're sharing this data, how it's going to be used, et cetera, that they have a chance to ask questions and understand about quotes and anonymity and so on, and then say, yes, I'm good to go. We can go ahead. So make sure that you're doing that at the beginning of your session. And then another practice with qualitative work is to do a check-in about this at the end of the session. So just this can be more of an abbreviated check-in on the consent at the end, but sometimes we found that people may have said more than they thought they were going to, or topics came up that they didn't anticipate, and they may want to make some shifts in the permissions that they gave at the start. And so that's good to bring that up at the end as well. And you can also kind of let them know how to be in contact with you in case that thought comes up to them later, and how they'll get a copy of the final report, et cetera. So, end of session check-in. As you're thinking about what to include in consent, just like your outreach language, you want to use plain language and really match the level of formality. Sometimes, if we're using really formal, kind of academic language about consent, we found that gets in the way of understanding. And what's most important is for people to really truly understand what's being asked of them. And so you want to make sure to use really plain language and match formality to sort of make sure that understanding is clear. Um, Topics to include as the purpose of the evaluation, what you're trying to learn, who is doing this evaluation, how the results will be used, how the results will be shared with participants and when. So when they can expect to see the results, what they are going can expect in the session that you're doing, format, duration, just similar to outreach, what level of confidentiality or anonymity is being used. If you're going to be using any quotes, and will they have an opportunity to review or approve any quotes, even if they're anonymous quotes? What benefits or risks may be involved? A statement that participation is voluntary, again, continue to underscore that, and a contact person for questions. So really similar to the outreach language, but just making sure that people are that all that same content is covered with an understanding that people are giving consent with after they understand that. Okay, so now let's move into writing your questions. You've got people, you've identified who you want to talk to, you've figured out how to get in touch with them, you've recruited them, you've got their consent. Now you're trying to, or probably while it's all going on, you are writing your questions. That's a protocol if you want to use fancy language for your interview guide or your discussion questions for your group. A protocol is your set of questions. So we're going to go over some tips for creating qualitative protocols. When you think about what to include in a protocol, and this is true for interviews or focus group discussions, um, you should include an introduction and those consent points that we just talked about, again, using plain language and matching formality. So you're going to want to make sure to cover that consent and introduce again what the purpose is of what you're doing and why you're gathered together or are doing this interview. It's good to take some time in the beginning to build rapport, whether it's an interview or a focus group discussion. If somebody feels like they're talking to another human and are feeling sort of comfortable and conversational, that will be really helpful for the richness and of the information that you're going to get from your qualitative method, whatever it is. Then you want to think about some ease in questions. And these are a chance to gather information that can help you, that besides just kind of easing into a discussion, they can also help you make sense of the data you're going to be analyzing. And so these can feel like kind of chatty questions, but can also give you important information. So things like, oh, how long have you been in the program? Um, and that can give you some insights. Maybe somebody who's only been in it for a little while might have different experiences than someone who's been involved for a while. So again, you're kind of providing them easy to answer questions, getting to know them, but it's also can be really helpful for your analysis. These questions can also be helpful for bringing people's minds back to a particular experience. Maybe as you're asking them about when they did that, when they went to this workshop or training, or where they did it, or how it was, what they remember about the facilitator or something like that, that can also help them with recall, sort of to bring up some of those memories again about, oh, that's right, that was that training. And oh, I remember we did those different activities. And so that's helping to bring those memories back so you can ask deeper questions about them later. And then you have questions that you're going to formulate that will help you answer your evaluation questions. So again, you've decided to do interviews or focus groups or whatever it is because you want to learn something. And so we'll get into next about framing questions that'll help you get at those. And then you're going to use some prompts and follow-ups to help you get deeper answers and fully understand what you want to learn. Before you get done, we always like to do a sort of general question about what else would you like to talk about that we haven't covered. And that's really helpful. Again, one of the reasons you're doing qualitative methods is you don't feel like you know everything. So, being really having that really open-ended, what's important that we haven't talked about allows people to raise that on their own. And lastly, of course, just checking back in on that consent um, point. All right, so now we've got a hot tip for you in terms of developing your protocol questions. So this is, we found a really helpful and critical step and helps your protocol to be comprehensive. And this is a valuable opportunity to learn from people. So you want to make sure that you're fully answering your questions, what you wanted to get to learn from this. And you also want to make sure you're not taking up your time or their time with questions that you don't need to get answered right now. Um, so what we would suggest is you think about what are the questions that you really want to learn about, and then align your interview or focus group questions, probably at least a couple interview questions or focus group questions for each of the your learning goals or learning questions. Um, We've got a table that we've got on this slide here that helps you kind of be organized and thinking through this. So you've got an evaluation question in the leftmost column, and that's what you want, what do you want to learn about? So that's your evaluation question. Then in the next column, you're going to list your interview or your focus group questions that you think will help you answer that bigger learning question. And again, you're going to want to have more than one-to-one probably. So at least a couple questions that are going to help you answer that bigger, higher level evaluation question. Then we recommend in the next column thinking through analysis plan. And so that's where you're thinking about what am I going to do in analysis and how is that going to help me answer my question? Thinking about this in the beginning can be really powerful and help you avoid missing things later on, especially. So, for instance, in your analysis, you might be thinking about, I want to understand if people who participate a long time are more confident about using skills than people who go to just a one-time workshop, or maybe a one-time workshop is enough for people to be confident about these skills. So if you think about that ahead of time in your analysis, that will remind you that you need to ask about how long people have been participating, as well as about their level of confidence um, and so you're able to do that analysis. And then lastly, we kind of, for the last column is from this, we will know or be able to say, and that's helping you just sort of play out. I'm going to expect that I will hear these kinds of answers in response to my question, and that will let me talk about and that would give me some themes that might look like this. And then to look back and say, do I think that that's going to really answer that evaluation question or learning question that I have? Having some structure like this can be really helpful for making sure that you ask all the questions that you want to or need to without kind of lots of extra questions that aren't needed. Then we have some tips about the questions themselves. So one is making sure you're asking questions that the person can answer. So about their experience, things that they know about. So if it's you wanting to know, as an example, maybe what challenges case managers have, you want to ask case managers themselves rather than their supervisors. So from the persons about their experience, things they've been able to experience or observe or participate in themselves. As you're writing questions, if you're thinking about if something is coming up that, oh, it's going to take a lot of thought to answer that question, perhaps you can find a way to break it down into multiple questions. So maybe you want to ask about how words or language can help to de-escalate a situation, and then ask another question about how actions can de-escalate a situation. So again, if it's going to require people to think about a lot of things at once, maybe consider breaking down a question. And then making sure questions are not leading. So a leading question is when you suggest a potential answer that they might give within your question. Um, So, for instance, is your diet going better since we made that change? Would be kind of a leading question. And so maybe instead you might say, how is your diet going since we made that change? So it's more neutral. Instead of asking if things are better, it's more of a neutral way of posing the question. So then we just want to do a few reminders about in terms of things to think about as you're writing effective questions. So we've got some examples of different forms of bias. One is social desirability. So we've got this little conversation role play happening on our slide here with a person on the left saying, "Oh, tell me about your reading habits," and a person on the right having a thought bubble thinking, I don't really like to read, but they're a librarian. So I'll say, "Oh, I like to read a lot." And so that would be an example of them tr answering more from social desirability rather than from their um, actual experience. Another one, a form of bias, is self-monitoring. So that, again, maybe the question on the left from the person saying, how much do you like to read? And the person on the right could be thinking of, oh, I don't like to read, but we're at a university and that's probably what's expected of me. So I think I'm going to say, I love reading. So they're monitoring their own response, given kind of where their circumstances of where they're at. So some of the things besides just obviously what's coming up here is some leading questions about how much do you like, but also some dynamics of who's doing the interview. So yeah, maybe thinking about that as you're thinking about who to have as data collectors. If they maybe can share characteristics with people they're interviewing, that might decrease some of these power dynamics. Um, so thinking also maybe where you're holding the interview. So if you're at a university, might that be influencing how people are? If you're sitting in the lobby of their major or outside their professor's door, they're going to loudly say how much they enjoy reading and doing and writing papers. So that's something else to think about. Another thing for this situation, or even social desirability, is thinking about normalizing a range of answers in a sentence before you ask your question. So maybe you would say, oh, people have a lot of different kinds of hobbies and things they enjoy. Some people read, and some people don't really like to do that as a hobby. How much do you like to read, if at all? So, anyway, that's an ex example of a question or a sentence that you might add just to normalize that there's other kinds of answers can be just fine. All right, so another kind of bias, we've got another little role play for you here on the slide is called acquiescence bias. And again, this is kind of in the framing of the question. So, in this one, the person on the left, the interviewer, is saying, "So, is the new format working better for you then?" And the person on the right's like thinking, well, I don't know. Yes, because it feels like they're expecting a yes answer from me. So instead of asking the question that way, you might instead say, how is the new format working for you? And you could even add something after that that says, I really want to hear your real answer and experience. That'll be helpful to me, whatever it is. So you might just add something afterwards too to say you really want to hear from them, whatever their real experience is. Okay, so we're going to have next a little time for you to practice. So we sent you should have in your email some resources for these different practice times we have during our webinar today. In this one, we're going to take a little time for taking a few minutes here just to write down some things that you might be coming up for you when you're writing if questions and being aware of your own biases. So you might maybe just take a minute to think down some of the biases that might come up to you as you think about an evaluation that you're doing right now, and then or a potential evaluation. And review your interview questions and think about if that bias is coming through. So that kind of self-reflection is helpful. Actually, I'm going to pair this. Sorry. We'll ask you to do that in a second when you're writing your questions. I'm going to cover one more thing before we get to that practice, and that's taking care in the context. So um, just lastly, before you get to practicing your writing questions, we wanted to just say that we know a lot of you are maybe doing evaluation in contexts where people have that are really sensitive, and maybe people have experienced violence themselves and or are closely connected to someone who has. So we want to provide some ideas about how to take care in this context. This isn't, of course, a deep training on this, just a few considerations to share right now. So one is providing questions ahead of time that helps people both kind of know what they're in for and think about what they do and don't want to answer and what they do and don't want to share. So that's helpful to do. Another really important one is focus on talking about and asking about solutions and recommendations rather than asking them to explain or describe their experience. So they don't need to relive or retell that experience, but instead focus your data collection on recommendations for your program or what kinds of resources are helpful rather than trying to get anything from them about their actual experience. Also, taking special care to remind people they can revoke consent, stop recording, or stop the interview at any time. Also, plan for breaks and for people to be able to step away, to get a drink, take a breath, decide if they want to continue. So make sure you've got some breaks in there for people to pause and reset and make sure that they're still feeling okay. And then also be prepared with some resources for support. One thing, again, we had a question about working with teens. One thing that we found in a recent project was even if you're planning on doing one-on-one interviews because it's a sensitive topic, one option could be for them, the interviewee, to decide if they would like to bring someone along with them that who would make them feel more comfortable or safe during the interview. So that's another consideration there. Okay, so now we're going to do some practice. So we sent an email with some sample interview questions, and you can think about ways to improve them. And then after you do, jot down um, some ideas for improvement. Remember, I just also, a couple of slides ago, also invited you to think about what biases might be coming up in that situation and think about how to improve the questions from that lens as well. So first, just try improving the questions and then think about what biases you might be bringing to this or the situation might be bringing and think about any improvements you might make from that lens. So let's take 10 minutes here to do some practice. So I've got 10:03 now, so 10:13 we'll wrap up our practice time. You should again have some materials for your practice that were emailed to you yesterday, or folks who registered after that just this morning, you should have received that email. As folks are coming back from the break, I'll just draw your attention to we had a great question requesting some examples of leading questions in the Q&A. So there's a few examples listed there for you to check out.
All right, I am going to jump in here and take over for Becky. We are going to dive into data collection and explore different data collection methods. So we are going to do another poll, um, and I think Becky is going to launch it, but Becky, let me know if it doesn't work on your end. But we are going to ask you, how do you do your best thinking? Do you do your best thinking on your own, with others, or a little bit of both? And it looks like majority of everyone here sees a combination of a little bit of both, both on your own and with others, on how to do your best thinking. So thanks everybody for participating in our poll, and we're going to look at different data collection methods, starting with interviewing. So, jumping into interviewing as our first method, we'll be looking at what are some tips for interviewing most effectively. So, when the interview first starts, you want to set the stage for how your conversation is going to go. So, you can welcome the person, thank them for taking part in the interview. Always try to use kind of a conversational tone and plain language to relay any consent information, as Becky went over earlier. I also always try to offer the opportunity to ask questions during the consent process, but I also offer the interviewees to interrupt me or the flow of conversation during the interview itself if they have any questions as we're talking in the interview. And then I provide my contact information for if they have any questions after the interview is over. You're trying to convey warmth, that you're a real person who is interested in them, and minor sharing or connecting can be helpful, but be careful to keep it neutral and a sharing space. So just really setting up the feeling of a conversation, as you're setting up this interview. And next, we'll talk about recording the interview. So, if you're recording the interview, it's very important for you to ask for the interviewer's consent to record and potentially to transcribe as well. So, you must explain all aspects of confidentiality of the recording and how the recording and transcription are being used, such as if it is being used for note-taking accuracy. That's one example. And if you're in person for the interview, you can place your recording device in everyone's line of sight. Make sure to glance at your device periodically to make sure that the recording is still working. I've definitely had a situation where we get halfway through the interview, I look at the recording device and I never pressed record. So that is something to keep your eye on. And to make sure that your recording is accurate, you want to make sure that your room that you're conducting the interview in is quiet. And if you're using a physical recording device, always bring extra batteries in case it dies. If you're using a cell phone, bring a cell phone charger. And always test your device before the interview to make sure that any technical issues are addressed ahead of time as much as possible. It always seems that to me that if I'm recording with a device in and I test it, everything works. Maybe some issues are happening while the interview takes place, but you can take that time during the interview to address any technical issues if you need to as well. And if someone does not consent to being recorded for your interview, that's totally okay. And if you're doing the interview virtually, you can also use the transcription functions without recording. So you could ask for consent to do transcription only if they're uncomfortable with a full recording. But if they do not consent to either recording or transcription, you can communicate to the interviewee that you might take a bit more time while taking notes to just ensure their accuracy of the interview. And on that note, a few tips about note taking. So, even if you're doing a transcript or using transcription functions, try to take notes during your interview as much as you can. Transcript volume can differ sometimes, and transcripts also capture the ums and ahs and those little filler words that we use to transition through talking. So that can make it difficult to work with the transcription after the fact when you're in the analysis process. So having notes is just a great practice overall. And while you're taking notes, try to type or write as you are listening, but maintaining some eye contact while an interviewee is speaking. If the interviewee says something that you think would make a great demonstrative quote for later, you can write that quote verbatim if you can, and then confirm that quotation by just repeating what you heard back to the interviewee and ask for any corrections or clarifications. And then after the interview is complete, I always try to clean up my notes immediately after the interview or shortly afterwards. If you leave note cleaning until later, then the interview won't be as fresh in your mind and you might miss important information and accurate quotes. During the interview, we always try to actively listen when the interviewee is speaking. So, using engaging body language, using verbal cues such as, that's right, I hear you. Verbal cues can help keep your voice in the mix and can also give some space for you to prompt or redirect if needed. Um, as you're actively listening, try to minimize any background distractions and just do your best to be as present as possible while you are interviewing and listening to your respondent. Also, some tips on how to customize the conversation. Uh, Sometimes during an interview, it can feel like you're just reading a script, and it can feel a little robotic if you're doing it for the first time or don't have a whole lot of experience with interviewing. So, like I said before, trying to maintain a conversational tone is super helpful. Also, knowing your protocol so that you can adjust as needed. So, if you know your protocol really well and somebody that you're interviewing brings up something that you know is down the line in your interview questions, you can actually change the order of your questions as needed. So if you think that it would be better to follow up with a question that is later on, then you can just bring it up to the front. So it would be better to follow the flow of the interviewee's storytelling and the conversation versus needing to strictly keep to the script. You can also preface any question that they've already partially answered. This happens a lot. So, in the flow of conversation, if in one question the interviewee starts talking about something that's coming up, you can say that you already answered the next question to some extent by talking about this in your previous answer. Is there anything else you would like to add about X? I feel like I do that a lot, and I've noticed in protocols that are specifically designed to talk about overlapping topics, that will definitely happen. And here we'll kind of talk about the difference between questions versus prompts. So, questions are carefully designed to answer the learning questions or evaluation questions that we need. So, those are kind of like maybe the main points of your protocol. And prompts are used when needed to clarify those questions to either get more detail or get different examples for different types of answers. So you're keeping your evaluation questions in mind, what you're hoping to learn, and how you're going to use what you are hoping to learn. And it's fine to take a moment to think about clarifications or prompts that will help you get there. Um, and then here at the bottom, we say, do ask, tell me more, and don't ask why. So just prompting them to expand on their answer versus asking why something is true for them. Another important tip is confirming your understanding of what interviewees are saying. So, using their words and phrases to summarize their response back to them and asking them whether you are correctly understanding their response, super helpful. And it's also helpful to your memory of what you're hearing in the interview and checking your own biases as you're going along. Doing this, uh, if I'm asking somebody, this is what I heard you say. Is that correct? As I'm taking notes about it, that can also jumpstart your analysis with possible emerging codes later on. During the interview, it's important to stay neutral as much as possible. We want to be curious, not judgmental of responses, and show equal appreciation for both positive, quote unquote, positive and negative responses. And critiques and accolades should cue you to ask about contributing factors to their opinion. So, if somebody is sharing something positive that happened to them, you don't want to say, "Oh my gosh, that's so great." And then if somebody shared something negative, you don't want to say, that's horrible. So trying not to present any type of judgment on an interviewee's response. And as you are wrapping up your interview, you can follow a few of these tips as well. Just stating these are all of my questions to indicate that the interview is wrapping up. As Becky mentioned earlier, when developing the protocol, we always have a kind of generalized question at the end asking what else an interviewee would like to share that we haven't yet talked about. Always thank your interviewee again for participating. Wish them a good rest of their day. And if they referred you to a colleague or somebody else that they think would be a good fit for the interview, remind them that you'll follow up about that recommendation. You can also send a thank you note or email. I've also had interviewees ask questions of me where maybe I didn't know the answer in the interview itself, and I want to follow up with them to make sure that that information is relayed to them. And now we will be moving on to a different data collection method, which is facilitating group discussions. So we're going to go over some tips for effectively facilitating group discussions. So each everybody has a role when you are doing group discussions. So the role of facilitator is really to set the stage for conversation with small talk, and the facilitator is responsible for guiding the conversation. They ask questions, probe for answers, manage the conversational flow, and keep the group on schedule because group conversations can tend to go off on tangents. So, a good facilitator has the experience of facilitating groups and conversations, including meetings or trainings. So, a good facilitator is knowledgeable about the topic, but doesn't need to be an expert on the topic, and relates well with participants. So, like I mentioned, using purposeful small talk to create a warm and friendly environment is really great when you're getting a group together who maybe this group doesn't know each other at all, and they're just coming in as strangers into an environment that maybe they've never been in before. A facilitator can also use pauses and probes to encourage sharing when with a group. Like I mentioned before in the interview tips as well, it's important for a facilitator to be neutral and unbiased, but you still want to remain interested in what everybody is talking about in the group. So don't be too far removed. Um, and a good facilitator is also controlling their own verbal and nonverbal reactions. You can also use subtle group control as the facilitator as well. Another role in facilitating group conversations as a data collection method is the note taker, which is one of the most important roles in this. A note taker can also be like a co-facilitator. So most focus groups will have a co-facilitator or a note taker, and that co-facilitator helps coordinate logistics, manage participants, and is responsible for recording all responses. So in our focus groups, the co-facilitator will run the audio recorder and note when participants are speaking using a timesheet or timestamps. You may also ask people to clarify what they mean or speak up as co-facilitator or note taker if you don't hear someone correctly or you're not sure that the recording captured what they said. You can interrupt to make sure that that's clarified. And because these focus groups could also be like a training opportunity, you may also facilitate a portion of the conversation depending on your comfort level. So the main facilitator might hand off main facilitation responsibilities to their co-facilitator, just like Becky did with me today. So I that's a good example. And now we're moving on to establishing ground rules, which is an important step for facilitating group conversations. So, after reviewing the purpose and the goals of the group, you can go over some ground rules for the conversation. So, this will really help set the tone, set the stage, and encourage open participation from all participants. So, ground rules can differ depending on the group that you're speaking with or that you're trying to get information from. But a few good common ground rules could include respecting each other's opinions, and we would like to hear from everyone. Um, and because we have limited time, the facilitator may move the conversation along so that we can get through all the questions. Establishing good ground rules will help you deal with different types of talkers that you may encounter during the focus group, and we are going to go over some of the different types of participants that you might encounter in focus groups as well. So you may have seen these categories before elsewhere, but we find them super helpful. There are four different types of talkers to kind of notice and identify when you are facilitating a focus group to really help manage the conversation flow. So you have the interrupter, the dominator, the quiet voice, and the disruptor, and we will go over all four. So, someone might be an interrupter if they are routinely cutting off other participants when they are speaking. That can discourage open conversation. So, it's important to identify if folks are interrupting other people in the flow of conversation. As a facilitator, it's important to politely remind them of the ground rules if it's important to set the ground rule of preventing interruptions. So thank them for sharing and reinforce that you would like to hear from everyone. And if it's relevant to the conversation, you can tell them to hold on to their thought and assure them that you'll come back to them at a later time once other participants have finished speaking. And if interruptions do continue, then you may have to ask that person to leave the conversation. The dominator is another type of talker. So you might have somebody who loves to share a lot and wants to share a lot. This is great. We obviously don't want to be in a focus group where no one wants to share anything. It's hard to get the conversation going. So we want to hear all perspectives. It's important that one voice does not drive every conversation in focus group. So if you're noticing somebody is being a dominator, you can find a downbeat. And if somebody begins to ramble or get off topic, everybody needs to breathe eventually. So you can find that in to to stop them and move on by kind of summing up what they said and thank them for sharing. And this will let them know that you've heard what they said. And if they are not satisfied and continue trying to talk, let them know that you can speak with them afterwards, after the meeting or after the focus group, if they would like to share more, but we do need to move on to other topics. And another way to kind of redirect the conversation is to ask others in the room if they have same or differing opinions, or ask the next question to others in the room. And then just like you have dominators, different type of talkers, you have those who are the quiet voice. So there will most likely be participants who are just naturally quiet and do defer to the dominators who are taking up over the conversation. So it's important to really try and engage those quiet voices as much as possible throughout the conversation. So I like to do what's described as a warm round robin introductory conversation so that every voice can be heard in the room before diving super deep, and really can help people get comfortable speaking in front of the group. And try to continue and reinforce that you would like to hear from everybody. Ask them by name if they agree or disagree with what others have said, or if they have a differing opinion. Ask them for elaboration by asking for examples or using nonverbal communication. You can nod at them, you can gesture at them with your hand as an entry point to ask them for more participation. And then the final type of talker is a disruptor. So it's probably very unlikely, but it is possible that a participant may become disruptive and try to derail the conversation, or make other participants uncomfortable. So if that happens, if they want to speak on the subject matter that you're trying to get at, let them know that they will get their chance to speak. Offer to speak with them after the meeting or focus group. You could also take a break to have a direct one-on-one conversation with this person to understand if this behavior is going to continue, or if you do have to make the decision to ask them to leave. All right, so I kind of flew through that. We are going to do another practice session to practice how to plan your discussion. So we're going to try mapping out some sample questions of your own to help you answer an evaluation question and add any possible prompts that you can think of. So if you want, you can jot down your improved questions in a Word doc. And that information should all be in the email that you received from Becky.
This is Becky. Should we take just 5 minutes for this practice? It's a little, just since we're just mapping some questions, we'll do 5 minutes, I think. And 10:45, come back.
Perfect.
Questions that came up in the Q&A. All right, let's go ahead and take over sharing my screen. Okay, we had some great questions in the that came up in our Q&A. So one was what are some examples of biases that could come up in a listening session or a needs assessment? So there's a great question, and there's various kinds. I can suggest a few that come to mind now. So, one is, as we talked a little bit about kind of recruiting earlier and outreach. So, one of the kinds of biases that come to mind is if there's you are only getting certain kinds of folks involved in your data collection. So, for instance, I'm thinking about like a needs assessment. If you do a lot of your recruiting through service providers, then you're only going to get people who are already accessing services. And so then you're going to maybe miss the perspectives of people who are not accessing services for a variety of reasons. So that would be kind of, there could be something in your outreach or recruitment that is narrowing the kind of perspectives that you're getting in your data collection. Another one that comes to mind could be one of the things that can be hard is for people to remember things accurately. So, trying to, I know a number of years ago, we were trying to, had an evaluation. It was a tough one of like trying to get people to recall back to how things were before an event happened. And so we tried to use some different uh, prompts to help them think about what was happening at that time in the world. And so, anyway, there just can be some things that people can't recall accurately. And so, trying to both provide some prompts about that time to bring those memories back. As well as prompting for details in their answers can help them kind of check themselves about whether what they're actually remembering. Um, there's also, we've talked about some different ways of framing questions and asking questions that might bias how people are answering. We talked about those a little bit earlier. Different dynamics in a group. So Ari talked a lot about different facilitation dynamics. So it could be if the whole group is agreeing about something and somebody has a different opinion, that can be difficult to get in the conversation. So your facilitation techniques that help people really, embrace that it's great to hear different kinds of opinions. That's why we're here. All the different perspectives are helpful and important to hear. So just things like that you can do during the facilitation to help people know that their differing opinions are welcome. Um, so those are just a few ideas that are kind of coming off the top of my head of different ways that you might have some bias in your needs assessment or your facilitation or your different kinds of methods. Another question that came up are there any benefits or drawbacks to paper surveys versus oral surveys? Can these be mixed in the same study with no problems? I ask because some people would rather take a survey on their own and some people prefer to be in a conversation. So we had a survey session yesterday. We're not getting deep into that, but I think generally the concept of like trying to meet people where they're at and thinking about what will be most effective for their engagement is helpful. And we have, we had we do a huge longitudinal survey where we're trying to engage folks who are living with disabilities and different kinds of living settings where they might be facing more segregation and less choice in their and autonomy in their lives than they would want. So anyway, we're trying to do a survey over time, and we offer that in various ways, but have found that a lot of folks would prefer us to be kind of facilitated through the survey. Rather than taking it on their own, that makes it more accessible to a broader group to more people within our sample. So I think just as long as you're paying attention to how you're doing that facilitation through an oral survey or something, and you're taking care about how you're doing it so you don't bias their answers just as you would as you're doing an interview in general, where you're trying not to prompt them or encourage one kind of answer or another. So paying attention to those same kinds of things, but in general, kind of choosing the method that will meet people best where they're at and help them share the information in a way that's most comfortable to them. All right, so let's move along here to uh, our agenda. So we've been talking about facilitation tips and effective interviewing, and now we're moving into note taking and analysis. All right, so um, note taking and analysis. Okay, we've got a beautiful poll here just to illustrate we're going to attempt to illustrate some kind of terrible data visualization with a word cloud. So, sorry, let me go back here and launch a poll. So our question for this poll is what are some, so let's say you've got your data, right? You've done all your fabulous question writing and facilitation, and now we want to know a word or phrase that describes how you feel when you know that it is time to analyze your data. The words or phrases in here, about a third of you so far. Thank you. All right, we're slowing down a little bit, so let's just see what's come up so far for folks about how you're feeling. Just see if I can share this. Beautiful word cloud. Sorry, it's blank again in my word cloud. We are going to try to be really hilarious and share a word cloud with you, as you probably have seen before, where there's just a group of the most commonly used words in people's answers, and then show you how that's kind of hard to always interpret. So this, as often happens when I try to make a joke, it doesn't go over. But some of the things that folks described in their word or phrase were overwhelmed or oh boy, which I could interpret either way. Energized, hopeful. Overwhelmed comes up again. Excited, anticipated. So some different, imposter syndrome came up. So different feelings when it's time to analyze. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your note taking and how to set that up to make your analysis life easier. So one thing is to think about how in-depth your reporting is going to be and then plan your note-taking accordingly. So perhaps your note-taking, your reporting is going to be pretty brief, and some bullet points of some of the main points will be fine of what people said. Or if you really are going to do some in-depth storytelling, then you're going to need to take more thorough notes. So just thinking about that ahead of time, and then you can adjust your note taking for the right level of detail. If you're in a Zoom session, you can turn on captions. We're lucky to have a cart captioner today, but if you've got just the auto captioning, you can get the full transcript. And again, as Ari mentioned, make sure to get consent for that. And then that can provide you details, as Ari said, maybe too much. So just trying to balance that out. as Ari mentioned, kind of cleaning up your notes or looking at your notes right afterwards, it's helpful. You can also spend 10 minutes kind of answering some summary questions, prompt questions based on the notes and right after an interview or listening session, and kind of thinking on what the main points were that you heard as the facilitator. And that can be again a helpful way to sort of jumpstart some of your reflections for analysis and give you some points to start with. If you're going to be doing less detailed reporting, then that's you might want to even take notes directly into an analysis template where you've got some prompts or categories for things that you're trying to answer for your big high-level evaluation questions, and you could even take some quick notes directly into those categories. So, like maybe you know that you're looking for what kinds of knowledge changes are happening from a training that you did, and you know that you're going to be that your training covered different kinds of knowledge changes. So maybe you have those as some categories, and you can take some notes directly into there. If I saw or observed people mentioning this knowledge change or that knowledge change, so that can also kind of jumpstart some analysis if you need to just kind of do some quick, less detailed reporting. That can give you a little bit of a head start there. So whatever your approach is, you want to think that through, as we're generally trying to tell you here, think that through ahead of time, what system you're going to use to take notes in and also to analyze your data to make sure that your notes will be compatible. So if you're going to use some software, sometimes it helps to know if that will, uploading a Word document or an Excel file will be more or less easy for whatever your analysis plans are. So kind of thinking through whether what will work there for you. And then another tip that we have is using some shorthand. All of us have some shorthand, maybe that we do. Like for instance, I always say CTY for community. Probably nobody else does, but that's something that I always do. And then you can use a control and replace, find and replace to clean up your notes at the end if needed to make that a little bit clearer. So that'll help you maybe keep up with the notes, but also clean them up quickly afterwards. As Ari mentioned, if you can confirm potential quotes during your interview, that's great. Like, oh, that was really great. I heard you say this. I'd love to use that as a quote. If you are doing that afterwards, you can kind of follow up to note them afterwards. One way or another, kind of highlighting those in your notes really helps you go back and find them later quickly. So that's helpful to do. Type in any unscripted questions so you know what people are responding to. So it may be that you did a follow-up question or a prompt that you weren't planning on doing, and people start answering that. So make sure to include the question that preceded those answers, so that kind of grounds you in your as you're looking at the notes later. And then with groups, this is really a critical one to indicate who said what with analysis. You can do this with names, or you can do just person A or something like that. But one thing that can happen if you don't do this is it's hard to understand later whether one person talked a lot or whether multiple people were all kind of agreeing and saying similar things. So you might have one person who's talking about how difficult it was. To follow the training. And they talk a lot, and you go back and look at their notes, and you might say, wow, this group was really, everyone in this group was talking about how difficult this training was, when really that was just one person talking about this one topic a lot. So if you can indicate that the speaker has changed in your notes, that's really helpful for you understanding whether something is a theme in that group, or again, just one person talking a lot about a single topic. So trying to indicate who said what in your notes. All right, so now we're going to get into conducting analysis. So generally, as you're doing analysis, this is the process that you're going to go through. You're going to scan and familiarize yourself with the data. You're looking to organize and categorize what you've heard. You're going to look for patterns in the concepts that are coming up. You're going to pay attention to important outliers, and you're going to then interpret and verify the results. So the organizing, scanning, and familiarizing yourself with the data kind of gives you a sense of what you have there, kind of volume of things, some sense about where, how many speakers you have, things like that. Organizing and categorizing, that might be, for instance, somebody spoke on a question 4, right in question 1, and you want to kind of reorganize the data to align with the different questions. You might want to categorize it a little bit, like these are all the answers about um, knowledge change on this with this question, and these are some of the answers that go with this question. So categorizing things a little bit, and then we're going to get into some of this, the what you're looking for in patterns and concepts as we get into analysis here, and thinking about outliers and verification. So we'll get into some of those concepts a little bit more in depth here. So patterns are what we sometimes mention as codes. You want to code your data. What does it mean by that? And that means that you're going to kind of label segments of what somebody said with a word or phrase that represents what you're seeing there. So somebody spoke for a whole paragraph, but there's particular words or phrases that are a theme or that are important to as answers to your question. You might see those words or phrases that are similar themes in somebody else's answers, and that begins to form a pattern, and then you're going to code that pattern or label that code as something that is a theme that's beginning to occur in the data that you have. Another thing that will also come up are outliers, and that's not a pattern, right? So there's maybe only 1 or 2 people said something. It is a unique experience or opinion, but those can also be really important, and it's just fine to bring those in when they're really a relevant and helpful insight for what you're trying to learn. So just because something is only said once doesn't mean you need to dismiss it, but it can provide you some important insight. So some tips for your analysis. One thing to do is to prevent overwhelm, which happens to all of us. That came up in the poll. People said overwhelmed. You're looking at a lot of data. And so sometimes making sure as you're reading through all these responses or data to oscillate or turn your attention frequently to what is it that you're trying to learn here? What are your evaluation questions? We wanted to understand if people learned something. We wanted to understand if people changed their behavior, and then go back and start looking at your data again. And that can help ground you again. And like, this is what I'm trying to learn. This is what I'm looking for in the data. And then as you're beginning to code, so that's helpful both for as you're reading the data, and then also as you're looking at what codes you're identifying. So whatever codes that you're saying, these are patterns that I'm noticing in the data. So I'm creating a code and tagging that this person said something that's aligned with that code or theme, that those codes should be relevant to what you want to learn about. They're the nuggets of your answer to your evaluation questions. So just kind of pausing to be like, am I identifying codes or patterns that are relevant to the question, the big question that I'm trying to answer here? And then remember that analysis, can vary depending on the circumstances of the evaluation. Maybe you're going to go real deep and be really careful with a lot of coding, or maybe you're going to kind of read things through and note themes that you're seeing on a Word document. We'll provide some different examples of different ways to do it. Whichever way that you do it, the key is to be systematic and verifiable. So systematic means that you're really looking at all the data, not just some. So not just looking for things that confirm what you thought would be there and ignoring things that might surprise you. So that could be another form of bias, right? So you wanting to be systematic, you're looking at all the data and not just some of it. Verifiable means that you can explain the logic of of what you put together as a theme to somebody else. So if you say, I see all of these different phrases and answers that people had as being a theme, that you can explain your logic of why they fit together under this theme. So that's kind of being systematic and verifiable no matter what method that you use for analysis. If you're going to get into more in-depth analysis, jot down notes on your reasoning for choosing a given code or for not including some piece of data. So just to, again, trying to keep yourself accountable to that systematic and verifiable, to kind of keep analysis notes that you could share with others as well. And then as you're going through all this data and potentially, again, trying to avoid the feeling of overwhelm, remember that it's okay to maybe skip irrelevant material. You're going to go back and check to make sure that you're being um, systematic and verifiable. But if somebody is talking about you're wanting to learn whether your training is effective, and somebody started talking about somebody else's training or a different training experience that they had that's not helping you understand if your training was effective, it's okay to skip that irrelevant material. Um, and as we mentioned, to kind of skim all your data when you start analysis to get a sense of your full data set. So that can give you, whether you start labeling, before you start even labeling anything as codes, just to kind of try to remind yourself of your data before you even start doing your analysis. If you've got a lot, that might be a little bit of a sampling around, or maybe if it's possible to skim read all of it. Um, just to get a sense of the whole picture before you start diving in. And then after that whole picture, you're noticing patterns. As we talked about those codes of common phrases, concepts that multiple people mentioned, and then also important outliers that are still giving you a good insight. Again, it is don't just as you would during data collection, as Ari mentioned, it's okay to follow the conversation and get to questions in a different order, but that also might mean that that you need to do a little bit of reorganization as you come back to do analysis. So you want to group responses that answer the same question together, even if they came from different parts of the protocol or different parts of the conversation. If you are using multiple tools, maybe you asked a question in a survey as well as in your listening session, but it's all the same question about a piece of knowledge change. If you want to group those together so you can see all the patterns that are emerging in one place. And then be aware of implications of quantifying qualitative data. You chose qualitative methods for a reason, and the results that you will get from this are themes, patterns, and outliers. They're not percentages. That is not why you did a qualitative method. So just be wary of that. Sometimes I do a little count to see if just to sort of check my reasoning. I thought this came up a lot when I count this theme. I see that it actually only came up a couple times. Maybe it's for some reason it assumed a big importance in my head. So I'll go back and sometimes count things just to check myself about why I'm saying something is important. Again, maybe I think it's important as an outlier, but I want to be careful just to be clear about whether it's an outlier or a common theme. So for that reason, you might do some counting, but really the reason why you're doing qualitative data is not to express it in a quantitative way or understand it in a quantitative way. Again, trying to be aware of your own biases to the extent that we can as humans. So maybe you really thought resonated with a particular person, or you think something is really effective, to try to be really aware of that as you're going into analysis to check your work through that lens and make changes as needed. So again, trying to be systematic and verifiable. Are you making sure you're not ignoring certain people's insights or insights that go against what you might have expected to hear or you think is valuable? So as you're doing this analysis, thinking about who's your analysis team. So there's different ways of doing this, of setting this up. But one of the things that's helpful to do is thinking about more than one person having a take on this. So you can kind of validate this subjective judgment that goes on in a qualitative analysis. You can compare notes with one another, and that can provide a little inter-rater reliability. You can share your reasoning with one another. Um, and then, or you can do some validation where somebody can just look at what you did and see if they can understand, maybe with a sample or everything, whether that they can validate your sort of reasoning behind naming things as certain codes or patterns. You can do this by kind of doing analysis on your own and then walking that interpretation through with others. You can divide the analysis up amongst team members and then compare notes with one another, maybe with some overlap between some common pieces of data and see if you came to some similar conclusions. Or you can do kind of participatory group analysis where you all share your perspectives. All right, so then two phrases that you may, or words that you may have heard about the type of analysis is deductive or inductive. And so we'll just kind of try to explain what those are. So deductive is where you're looking for something specific. You're looking for an answer to your question. For instance, we have one client who asks youth to name root causes of violence, and they've done some training about this. They're really looking for youth to use certain vocabulary and language that they've done training on. We are looking for that in the answers that we get back from youth to reflect whether or not they're getting that from the curriculum and the training. Um, that's a needle. We've got a picture here of a gigantic needle in a haystack, so a little more obvious than many needles in a haystack, but essentially you're looking for that needle, looking for some particular kind of data within your data set. Inductive. Here we have a picture of a word find where we're circling, in this case, some words that we found. One word is lost and another word is found. But inductive means you're really open to finding what emerges. So whatever, you're not looking for particular named root causes of violence, you're looking for whatever people said around causes of violence, and if in that example, and letting the information in your responses guide how you frame your analysis. So for this kind of approach, what you do is start reading the responses, move to the next, and see if some theme or pattern is coming up. And when you find repeat mentions of a theme, then you would create a code and then go back and code where you saw that concept coming up. So this is really responsive to what people said, brought up for themselves and how they wanted to express it. The con is that this can take some more time and be more time consuming, whereas the deductive reasoning or deductive approach can be quicker. I'm just going through and saying, here's the root cause of violence, here's the root cause of violence, they named it or not. Whereas this is is more emergent and takes more time. So once you have thought about your analysis um, a little bit and how you're going to approach it, you're going to think about what tools you're going to use for your analysis. We have a few different options here, again, depending on what your ultimate purpose is. Just using Microsoft Word is an option, or Word Google Doc is an option. So you want to have your evaluation questions set up in bold, and you go one by one through your notes, read through your notes, and copy and paste anything that's relevant to that evaluation question under it. Then you keep going like that through all your notes until you've got your notes sorted out under each evaluation question. Then you're going to read through your data on each evaluation question, and on a different page, identify the key ideas that came up as answers to your evaluation question. And these are your findings. Your findings are answers to your evaluation questions. You can do some color coding on your document to indicate different speakers, and that will help you understand again how many times something was said, if that was a really common answer to a question, or if that's just one person talking a lot. So just like we said in your notes, it's important to indicate when a speaker changes. Using some color coding in your analysis can help you understand that. So here's a little example of that, where you've got a question, your evaluation question at the top, um, understanding where what do participants say could be done to improve the program. And then you've got your answers that people said below, and you've got some different color coding to see you've got 3 different people saying something that's relevant to this question. So you're going to read through the data. I'm not going to read through all the examples of data here. It's what's more important is that we wanted to show how you've got sort of multiple sentences or paragraphs from each person. You've got a different color code for each person to understand how many times something comes up in a response. And so you're just kind of going to read through that content, and on a separate page, write down what the takeaways were as potential answers. So this is kind of a lighter form of analysis, maybe a little bit quicker. Another option for a quick approach is to answer your evaluation question using using a table setup. So we mentioned this um, earlier. So maybe in Microsoft Word or a Google document, you could set up a table. And you've got, in this example that we've got here, we've got our focus group question in the leftmost column. The next column are the key points from, in this case, example school number 1. And then in the next column, the key points in this example for school number 2. And then in the third column for school number 3. And then in the final column, we have where you can write down the key themes that are coming up for this question. An example we have, how would you make changes? How would you change the poster to make you or your friends want to eat school meals? In school number 1, you've got a couple ideas that came up from the responses in a focus group or whatever it was, to make it look fun or associate eating with social time. At lunch, school number 2, a couple key points that came up: show other kids actually enjoying it, show them that trying the same food together. School number 3, a couple points that came up said show youth on the poster, and that it can't just be about can't just be messages about vitamins and nutrition. So maybe a couple key themes that you're noticing coming up in answers to this question about changes to posters are using images of youth and making it be about fun and enjoyment, more about being social than about nutrition. Another way to approach analysis could be in Microsoft Excel, and that could be helpful for uh, where you've got not really long paragraphs and paragraphs of answers to each question, but it could be open-ended questions from a survey, maybe shorter answers in an interview. So if you don't have, again, paragraphs of answers to each question, that Microsoft Excel can be really helpful. That's what we've got for our example for you to work on today. And then the leftmost column, we've got an example here of how your Excel sheet might be set up. We've got characteristics in the first few columns here. In this case, it's actually from like kind of a document review. So we've got author is the first column, age is the next column, and finally therapy type is the third column. Really, these are characteristics of who answered things to help you provide context to your analysis. And then we've got in this case, the next column over is abstract, or this could be the answers to your questions. So this is your data. And then the next column over to the right is you set up a column here for your first code, and then the next column over for your second code. So as you're finding uh, themes that emerge. If you're doing inductive analysis, you would label that code number one with what you're seeing emerge. Or if you are doing deductive analysis, you might be looking for a certain code and you'd label that code one with the code that you're looking for. So you can freeze your panes in or freeze your page in Excel so that you can kind of scroll to the right with different labeling different codes with an X as it's coming up. And we've got an example for you in your practice document today, but that can be really helpful. And then finally, you can also we mentioned group analysis and some collaborative analysis using a whiteboard or post-it notes. And this is kind of affinity mapping. In another way, we've got a picture of a person here in front of a whiteboard with a bunch of post-it notes of different colors that they're grouping together. So you might be put your just different responses on post-it notes and then group the ones together that are similar. And physically group them together. And then you can kind of see what's emerging, label those themes. So this is a picture of a person doing it in real life with post-it notes. You can also do a version of this on a whiteboard software such as Miro or an online whiteboard. We've got a complex picture here of a similar thing with different colored post-it notes under the prompt general challenges around volunteering. And we've got a bunch of notes crowded together under some different emerging themes. So one emerging theme for challenges is people don't know how to engage. And then there's some post-it notes clustered under that. Next to that, we've got another post-it note labeled hard to fill roles. And we've got a bunch of post-it notes grouped together under that with the responses that people had that fit the theme of hard to fill roles. So I won't describe all the rest of these examples, but essentially it's just a whiteboard where you're got your responses that you're grouping together under themes as you would with physical sticky notes, but you're doing it on a whiteboard instead. And then finally, if you do have fancy software like Deduce is what we use, or NVivo or Atlas TI, you can use that for your analysis. We won't obviously get into like how to use that software here today, but of course that's an option, especially important when you've got a large volume of data or really need to do some in-depth analysis. We're going to take some time here to do a little bit of practice. You got some coding on the sample uh, uh, spreadsheet that we sent that you can try your hand at coding on the spreadsheet that we sent. And then the other thing you might do during this time, before we start talking about sharing and ways to share, is your results is think about what would be responsive to your community. How do folks that you're trying to connect with like to receive information? What are some different ways that they might look to learn something that are already present in your community? And then how might you use those same methods to share back what you learned? So let's take, I've got 11:29. Let's take maybe 5 minutes to just do a little bit of playing around and practice coding on the sample spreadsheet. Take a moment to answer a few questions that have come up. They're great questions. So we're going to answer two of them now, and then one of them is like right on the money for what Ari is going to talk about next. So we'll leave that last one for her to answer in this next section. So one of the questions that came up was, is it helpful to use AI tools to pick out patterns and common themes? Oh, that's a big one. So I will just say that we do not, Improve Group does not use AI for any analysis and qualitative methods. We know, of course, it's an emergent tool that it's intended to, one of its uses is to make processing a lot of information quicker and easier. Some of the reasons why we have avoided using it, One is that is around kind of consent, and that in order to, if we're going to be putting data into an AI tool to conduct analysis, we want to make sure that we can clearly tell people exactly what's going to happen with their data, where it's going to go, how it's going to be protected, and potentially shared even anonymously. So we don't feel confident that well, first we're concerned that folks that will turn people off participating, and we don't want that. And we also want to make sure that we want to be confident in our ability to really accurately describe that and make sure that what we've described is exactly where it's going to go and all the protections and each of the stops along the way. Um, and so we just feel that that's going to dissuade people from participating. So that's and we want to make sure that we can be accurate in that in order to ethically get their consent to share information in that context. So that's um, one of the reasons why we don't. The other thing is that even when we've played around with it, not with our client data, um, I guess summarizing or beginning to notice some common themes is something that it has done okay, but I will say that humans' interpretation is still, in our experience, stronger. So, for instance, perhaps you're noticing that when people are prompted about de-escalation activities that they might have done, and they're talking about that, you're noticing that in none of the examples that they provide do they talk about being in a large group setting like a party or I don't know, tailgating event. I don't know, but you're noticing that they're not talking about large group events. They're only talking about one-on-one conversations or something like that. So I think that being able to, from your knowledge about what you're trying to learn and what is important information, being able to interpret what is important, even in things, what is omitted from being said, can be really powerful. So I think there's just something to be said for human interpretation. Um, the next question that we had is about resources for an online whiteboard. I'm going to go ahead and just put those two resources that we commonly use in the chat. They have different pros and cons, but we use both of them and like both of them. So I'll put those two uh, ideas in the chat. And I'll turn things over to Ari to take us home with tips for sharing.
Thanks, Becky. We are at our final section of today's webinar, so just want to thank everybody for your attention and engagement through these questions. They've been such great questions. But we are going to finish up with some tips for sharing and reporting. Um, so Becky, if you could go to the next slide. We are going to look at various tips. We are unfortunately not going to be able to go into huge depth about reporting. There are lots of different topics that can be covered in reporting, but these are some of the tips that we think are the most important. So when you are creating, after your analysis is done, you are ready to put this information out into the world. You can use some of these tips. So when you are creating your report as a visual document or a product, you can use quotes from your data collection in the text or in call-out boxes to really humanize participants and increase empathy for readers to understand that what they are reading or consuming or taking in as a reporting product, that has come from real people who said real things. So using quotes really humanizes the folks who participated in your data collection and were part of your project. Next, another important step is related to quotes, is to double check any quotes for anything that could potentially identify the person who said it. So that could look like the person describing a unique experience that's truly unique to them, a circumstance or a different identity that they hold. And we want to when double checking those quotes, we want to remove any potentially identifiable information from the quote without changing the meaning of that quote and its impact. And next, we also want to report on themes as answers to the overarching evaluation questions that you are trying to answer and that you identified at the beginning of your research process. So, using those evaluation questions as kind of your anchor as you are developing your report or product that you're going to use in sharing this information. Also, instead of quantifying data in a qualitative report, in qualitative reporting, you can use different qualifying words like most, many, some, or a few. It is worthy to note that it's important to define what these qualifying words mean somewhere in your report or your sharing product before using them. So, some people might think that a few means exactly three, but that may not be true for your report or for your data set. So you want to make sure that you define what these qualifying words mean before you use them. And lastly, it's important to that you would ensure that your results are shared with the people who provided you with the data that you are presenting, in addition to other key audiences. And Becky, I think it'll be the next slide. So, for instance, if you interviewed a group of people or held focus groups in those conversations, we talked about this previously. You should have told them how their data and information was going to be used and shared back with them. So you want to ensure to follow up with those people during the reporting and sharing out phase, so that you A, keep your word, and B, they know what happened to their data and what resulted from it. And now I also want to address the question that came in during the break. Kristen wrote an amazing question that says, I work with a population that speaks many different languages, so interviews and or groups by language would be effective. However, in producing a product for them to review at the end of the study would prove difficult not only because of the languages spoken, but even more so because many of them are from rural areas in other countries and illiterate in their own languages as well as in English. How can I best address this without infantilizing my participants? This is an amazing question, and I wanted to address this by saying that another thing to think about is that the actual format that you use to do the sharing and reporting does not have to look one way. Many times, when people think about reporting, they think that it looks like a physical written document, a long report that is like 50 pages or something, where it's a long document that requires a lot of reading. And in this case, that audience might not you might decide that a long report is not the best format for that audience and who you want to share this information with or back to. So keep in mind that reporting and sharing out different products can be just as creative as the methods that we talked about earlier. So reporting and sharing could look like a shorter, more graphically designed document with like lots of images. Or it could look like a recorded podcast where it's people speaking verbally about what has been learned from the data and having that be recorded in some way, whether that's video, audio, or something like that. It could look like an art installation where artists are using what has been learned from the data collection and creating a mural or other art installation to kind of discuss what was learned in the project. Or it could be any other event that shares the stories and perspectives that you gathered through your qualitative data collection. So it's a great question, and just emphasizing that reporting and sharing out does not have to look like any one way. It can be very creative and different depending on the audience that you're trying to share this information with. And we made it To the end. We did it. So, just to summarize what we learned and covered for today, we covered a lot. We've been here for 3 hours, so that's amazing. We discussed why and when to use qualitative methods, different sampling and recruitment practices and techniques, how to write effective questions and create your protocol, effective interviewing tips, group facilitation and focus group tips, and what to look out for during both of those types of methods and how to facilitate properly. And then also looked at note taking and setting up for analysis, all the different ways you can do that, the analysis process itself, and we finished out with some tips for sharing and reporting. And I will pass it over to Becky to close us out.
Yeah, this is Becky again. So again, thank you for your sticking with us today for a long webinar and during that time sending us some great questions. I really appreciated. They've added a lot to the our time today. So thank you for that. Thank you for being here. We will be sending a survey out after this, so you can let us know what ways we can, what worked well and where we can improve. That would be super helpful for us, and we look forward to hearing back from you on that. And hope that you'll stay in touch if you would like to connect in the future. So. Um, We've enjoyed the opportunity to be with you today and wish you all the best in your work. You all do a lot of powerful work that makes a big difference in our communities, and we hope there's some tidbits here that will help you be even more effective in your work and making even more of a difference. So thanks again for your time today, and we've enjoyed the time together. We'll be following up again with that survey if you want to keep an eye out for that, and there will also be later on a recording as well as a copy of these slides and the transcript from the session today. Thanks again. Hope you have a great Thursday ahead of you.